Nathan Cole was 29 years old, and he had built his entire life around not being noticed. He worked as a technical specifications reviewer at Hargrove and Pratt, a modest architecture firm tucked into a converted warehouse in Denver. He checked blueprints for errors other people missed, flagged measurements that didn't add up, and went home to an apartment that still felt half empty 4 years after Megan died. She had been crossing a downtown intersection when a delivery truck ran the red light. Nathan got the call at 11:40 at night, and something in him had stayed frozen in that hospital corridor ever since. He didn't date. He didn't open up. He told himself solitude suited him just fine, until Claire Donovan started showing up at his desk with coffee he hadn't asked for. Claire was 31, the project coordinator who quietly held the entire office together without ever raising her voice. She remembered everyone's deadlines, kept spare chargers in her drawer, and once left a packet of aspirin on Nathan's keyboard the day he came in with a migraine and tried to pretend otherwise. He had liked her for almost a year, never said a word, because Claire was engaged to Tyler Briggs, a finance analyst with a tailored coat and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tyler talked about Claire the way other men talked about real estate. A good investment, a good look, a good addition to the life he was building. When the cream-colored invitations went out, Nathan got one too, and he told himself he could sit through one afternoon watching the woman he cared about marry someone else. He was wrong about how that afternoon would end. St. Bartholomew's was full by 10 that Saturday morning, stained glass throwing colored light across 200 folding chairs, the smell of white lilies thick in the air. Claire stood at the end of the aisle in a dress her mother had sewn, radiant in a way that made the whole room go quiet. Then the minutes started piling up. 10, 20, 45. The murmurs shifted from polite concern into something crueler, and somewhere behind Nathan a stranger laughed and said the bride had been stood up. Claire's maid of honor ran up with a phone, and Nathan watched something break behind Claire's eyes as she read 3 words from Tyler. I can't. Sorry. 5 years together ended over text. Nathan thought of Megan. Not because the two women were alike, but because he remembered exactly what it felt like to watch someone he cared about get destroyed by something he couldn't stop. Except this time, the person was still standing right in front of him, breathing, waiting. He didn't decide to stand. His chair just scraped back, and 200 heads turned as he walked down the aisle. The minister asked who he was. Nathan said the only true thing he had. I'm the man who's going to marry Claire today. The church exploded into whispers. Claire stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but he leaned close and told her she didn't have to leave humiliated, that if she wanted a way out, he was standing right there. She looked at the phone still recording, at her mother crying, at the people who'd been laughing seconds earlier, and then she looked back at him. Are you sure? She whispered. He was. Claire's father rose from the front row, studied the empty space where the groom should have stood, then studied Nathan instead. If his daughter agreed, he said, then so did he. The minister couldn't legally marry them on the spot, but he could lead a public commitment ceremony, and when it came time for vows, Nathan didn't say anything rehearsed. He promised never to use her pain as entertainment, to protect her dignity, to never let her stand alone again if he could help it. Claire promised she wouldn't forget that he'd stood up when no one else had. The kiss was brief, more respect than romance, but when they walked back down the aisle together, Claire had stopped shaking. The reception was already paid for, the cake still monogrammed with the wrong initials, the band still playing songs picked for a different ending. Nathan stayed at Claire's side through every whispered theory about affairs and stunts, fetched her water, steadied her dress, and answered questions with the same flat line, long enough to know she didn't deserve this. Claire's father found him at the bar later and asked if he loved her. Nathan said he didn't know if he had the right to call it that yet, but he respected her, and he wasn't going to lie to a man whose daughter had already been lied to once that day. That night, Claire had nowhere to go, not the apartment she'd planned to share with Tyler, not her parents' house full of stunned relatives, so Nathan brought her to his small place, took the couch, and gave her the bedroom. She came out of the bathroom later in his oversized t-shirt, makeup gone, and said only that it felt warm there. Over chamomile tea, Nathan laid out the truth. People would talk, the video would spread, and they had options. Deny it happened, ride it out quietly, or actually try to know each other. Claire asked what he wanted. Nobody had asked him that since Megan died. He said he wanted to make sure she was okay, and to know her outside of the worst day of her life. That was where it started, not with romance, but with two bruised people choosing not to lie to each other. The weeks that followed turned the staged marriage into something neither of them had named yet. Strangers online called Nathan a hero or an opportunist. Their boss called them into his office, certain it would end in a resignation, but Claire walked in with her spine straight and told him their private life would stay outside office walls. She left notes on Nathan's fridge about lunch. He started making her tea without being asked. She told him about her grandmother teaching her to sew, about her mother working 2 jobs. He told her about his parents, about never wanting anything bigger than a steady job and someone who didn't see an ordinary life as failure. One evening, she found his late girlfriend's photo on the shelf and simply said she'd been beautiful. No jealousy, just gentleness. He told her part of him would always love Megan, but it wasn't the same as loving someone who was still there. It was a locked room he didn't live in anymore but hadn't torn down either. Claire said she didn't want to replace her, only to be there if Nathan let himself be happy again. Something between them softened after that. Months passed. Then Tyler reappeared at the office in an expensive coat, telling the receptionist he needed to see his fiancée, as if nothing had happened. Nathan got there first and told him she wasn't his fiancée anymore. Tyler sneered that the marriage wasn't real, that Claire had only married a co-worker out of shock and humiliation. When Claire stepped out and saw him, her face went pale for exactly 1 second before she straightened and asked what he wanted. Tyler claimed he'd panicked, that seeing her with someone else had made him realize his mistake. Claire laughed, short, bitter, and asked if that realization had come after she stopped waiting alone at the altar. Cornered, Tyler turned cruel and told the truth he'd hidden. Before the wedding, he'd been seeing Olivia Sinclair, daughter of a major property developer, and the night before the ceremony she'd given him an ultimatum: marry Claire and lose the connections, or walk away and step into her father's investment fund. He'd chosen the fund. Claire went very still, not from heartbreak, but from the realization she'd been weighed like a bad investment and found wanting. Tyler tried turning the story online afterward, calling the marriage fake and accusing Nathan of preying on a vulnerable woman, and for a few days, Claire read every comment in the dark, quietly taking her ring off and putting it back on like she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to wear it. Nathan found her on the back steps one night, knees pulled to her chest, asking if she was dragging him into too much trouble. He told her he'd had a quieter life before that church, and it had been peaceful, but it hadn't had her in it. The next morning, Claire posted her own words instead of letting Tyler write the story for her. That her marriage had started in chaos but had become a choice. That the man who left didn't define her and the man who stayed didn't own her either. That she'd chosen this because it respected her. After that, she stopped flinching at the comments. Tyler made a few more attempts to insert himself, then disappeared from their lives entirely. Claire moved fully into interior design at the firm. Nathan started evening classes toward a project management certificate, not to prove anything, but because for the first time he wanted to build something solid on purpose. One ordinary night over takeout, Claire told him she loved him, not out of gratitude, not because he'd saved her, but because he made her tea without being asked and read her sketches like they mattered. He told her he thought he'd loved her since before he believed he was allowed to. A year after the church, Claire asked him to marry her again, this time in front of people who actually loved them, not the ones who'd laughed. 40 guests gathered in her parents' backyard under string lights. Her father walked her down a short aisle of folding chairs and told Nathan that last time he'd stood up for her, this time he should simply stay. Their vows were different now, deliberate instead of desperate, chosen instead of improvised. 2 years later, Claire became the firm's lead designer, and Nathan finally finished his certification. She got pregnant that fall, and when she showed him the test, her hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. They named their daughter Joy because Claire said that was exactly what she'd found again on the day she thought she'd lost everything. There were nights, even years later, when Nathan would wake before the alarm and just watch Claire sleep, struck by the same disbelief he'd felt walking down that aisle uninvited. He never told her how often it happened, only that some mornings he still couldn't quite believe his life had folded itself around hers so completely. Claire's mother, who had once looked at him with quiet suspicion, eventually started calling him just to ask how his week was going. No excuse needed. George began inviting him over on Sundays to fix things that didn't really need fixing. The two of them standing in the garage talking about nothing in particular, which Nathan understood was its own kind of acceptance. At work, the gossip eventually dissolved into something smaller, a story people told new hires, half myth, half cautionary tale about a man who stood up in a suit that didn't quite fit. Claire kept a single photograph from that first chaotic day, not of the ceremony itself, but of the moment right after, when Nathan had reached for her hand without anyone telling him to. She framed it small and tucked it on a shelf where guests rarely looked because it wasn't meant for guests. It was meant for the two of them, on the days they needed reminding that something built from wreckage could still hold. Years afterward, Tyler called once, out of nowhere, to say he was sorry and that he finally understood what he'd done. Claire told Nathan she'd forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved the peace of letting it go. If he hadn't left her standing there, she said, she never would have found the life she had now. That evening, they ordered pizza. Their daughter fell asleep between them on the couch, and Nathan thought about that church one more time and knew that if he had to choose again, he'd still stand up, still walk past every laughing face, still say the same 6 words. Sometimes a whole life doesn't change because of a perfect plan. Sometimes it changes because, in someone else's worst moment, you choose to stand and you stay long enough afterward for one act of kindness to become an entire life.